Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and discusses 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. Aurel Kolnai lived from 1900 to 1973 and was a Hungarian philosopher. He started out as part of Freud's circle, but later became a notable proponent of phenomenology. He converted to Catholicism in 1923, but, a Jew by birth, was forced to flee Europe with the rise of National Socialism. He had critiqued that ideology in his best-selling book, The War Against the West. In addition to his contributions to phenomenology, he is best known for his essays on ethics and political philosophy, especially for his analysis of privilege, hierarchy, and utopianism. In this interview, McAleer discusses Kolnai's thought. Today's guest, McAleer, is a professor of philosophy at Loyola University in Baltimore, Maryland. He has taught at Loyola for 30 years and was awarded Teacher of the Year in 2014. He regularly teaches courses in ethics, security, strategy, war, and law. He is also a member of the Judicial Ethics Committee of the State of Maryland and a regular contributor to the national online magazine Law and Liberty. He is the author of Ecstatic Morality and Sexual Politics, a Catholic and Anti-Totalitarian Theory of the Body, published by Fordham. To Kill Another, Homicide and Natural Law, published by Routledge. Eric Shivara and Postmodern Natural Law, A History of the Metaphysics of Morals, published by University of Notre Dame Press. Tolkien, Philosophy of War, published by Catholic University of America Press, and he's the co-author of Time for Dying, published by Routledge, and The Wisdom of Our Ancestors, Conservative Humanism and the Western Tradition, published by the University of Notre Dame Press. The books recommended and discussed in this episode are all by Aurel Kolnai. The first is Undiscussed. The second is The War Against the West. Third, Privilege and Liberty, and Other Essays in Political Philosophy. Fourth, Ethics, Value and Reality. And fifth, The Utopian Mind and Other Papers, a critical study in moral and political philosophy. Links to these books can be found in the show notes of this episode. And if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top rating on the platform of your choice. Professor McAleer, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Who was Aurel Kolnai?
I think the most interesting thing to begin with his biography is that his name was actually Aurel Stein, but he changed his name around about the age of 20. He was born into a Jewish family, a completely secular Jewish family. He changed his name to Kolnai. The origin of this name is very opaque. There's a very good biography of Kolnai by Francis Dunlop, an Englishman who's done perhaps the most to get Kolnai's work into print. And he sort of investigated this name. It's actually not a Hungarian name. It seems to be completely fabricated, but it is the name by which, he changed his name legally. And then, of course, when he converted to Catholicism in his 20s, his full name became Aurel Thomas after Thomas Aquinas, Kolnai, even though he himself was not much of a Thomist, which is sort of an interesting thing. And then maybe you could just, his biography is a very interesting story, but it's a very sad story as well. You might just say he was a kind of a refugee for the rest of his life, because although he had converted to Catholicism, of course, he was Jewish. And with the Holocaust, he fled Europe, and he never, ever got a formal academic position. In the American system, we would say he was an adjunct. He was always on the periphery of university life, even though he wrote philosophy in English, German, Hungarian, French, Spanish. He was a super gifted man. And I think one thing I would characterize his thinking, he's not a thinker of pastiche. It's not always easy to understand who he's reading, what his sources are. He's an extraordinarily original thinker. So he certainly deserved a place in the academy. He never found one. This meant that he was quite poor all of his life, often living directly off charity, Catholic charities, friends who gave him money. He and his wife, she, to earn a bit of money, she did translations. She also was linguistically gifted. So it is a little bit of a sad story, a kind of a man out of place, but caused by, obviously, having refugee status in World War II. And basically what happened, he leaves Europe, he goes to America, lives in Canada for a while, in Quebec, that he did not care for a number of different reasons, and then ultimately ended up in England, which he loved. He'd always loved. He was always an Anglophile. So he came into the Catholic Church through the influence of J.K. Chesterton. And quite strangely, right, because he was born in 1900, but already by the time of the First World War, he was an Anglophile. And although Austro-Hungarian, he supported the Allies although a teenager, a precocious teenager, he supported the Allies in World War I. So he was absolutely thrilled when he landed in England, and tended to think of himself oddly as an honorary Scotsman. And the reason he did was because he liked the idea of understatement, and he thought the Scottish were very understated.
What are the main areas in which Kolnai writes?
It's a very, very good question, because he's quite capacious. He's always blending ethical thinking with political thinking. He began in the Vienna circle of Freud. So his very, very first book was called Psychoanalysis and Sociology. He wrote it as a very young man. He might not even have been 20 yet. I don't know that people particularly put much weight by it. But anyway, he had, and this maybe goes to, he was a peculiar man. And he was at the Vienna Circle in the presence of Freud, and he had a formal intellectual break with Freud where he abandoned the sort of the dynamics of psychoanalysis for the phenomenology of Max Scheler. And I would say that's the sort of continuing thread throughout his work, is the value phenomenology or the value ethics of Max Scheler. This, of course, puts him in a kind of a school-like tradition with John Paul the Great. But I would say the blending of ethical thought and never forgetting the relationship between ethical thought and political thought is a signature of Kolnai's thinking. He's not much of a metaphysician, in that, a bit like someone like Max Scheler, he thinks that the ethical will actually alert you to fundamental sort of metaphysical sort of assumptions or insights. So he's very unlike, for example, Eric Chavara or even a Balthasar, who are going to be whose starting point is going to be sort of more sort of metaphysical and then get into more cultural. People like Scheler and Kolnai, I think, start the other way. They start with the ethical and the political.
That's somewhat odd, because one of the criticisms that people would move against phenomenology as a movement is that political philosophy is the area it's tended to write less on. I mean, there is a notable lack of political philosophy among phenomenologies, unless it's oblique, as some would allege Heidegger has an oblique political philosophy.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's, if you think about the first three great phenomenologists, Husserl, Heidegger, and then I would say Max Scheler, Scheler introduces the sort of the ethical focus. And then if you ask, if you just think about this Schelerian tradition in Catholic ideas, then you might say that John Paul II sort of fuses Scheler with Thomism, and then I think you would say that what Kolnai brings is he takes phenomenological ethics and he does show the intricacies or the connective tissue that it has with political questions. So if somebody wanted to kind of be working within the phenomenological method, but also wanted to look at politics, then Kolnai is very much an avenue. to take.
To skeptics, what would you say about why Kolnai is worth reading?
I would say because of the phenomenological sensitivity. Now, there'd be another way to look at it, maybe. So, I still think there is a divide in philosophy between your sort of continental tradition coming out of phenomenology and then your Anglo-American tradition or analytical philosophy. So, when Kolnai ultimately ended up in England, that was in the 1950s, and of course, sort of linguistic analytical philosophy utterly dominated. I'm not sure any of them were reading Nietzsche or I can't, at least when I went to university in England, nobody was reading Nietzsche. We were all still reading A.J. Ayer, Quine. So when Kolnai arrived with all of his sort of Schillerian background, because he'd done his PhD on Schiller, he immediately was quite struck by the usefulness of analytical philosophy to work on ethical questions. So he blends phenomenology with analytical philosophy in some quite interesting ways. One interesting way would be, I think I mentioned before that, of course, Kolnai was linguistically gifted. And of course, given his being born in 1900 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he knew Greek and Latin. But unlike someone like Heidegger, who thinks there's something about the ancient languages that are very important for the doing of philosophy, Kolnai's work is marked by looking at modern languages. So often his essays will begin, as you would expect from an analytical philosophy perspective, with looking at, so for example, let's say he took the topic of obligation. Then he would look at the word obligation as you might find it in Portuguese, in German, in Russian, and so he's quite interesting that way. I think that his interest in language is very unlike Heidegger's. He doesn't think there's anything particularly mystical about what language might tell you, but he does think it's a very important starting place for understanding our moral concepts. And I think the other thing you might say to a skeptic is that method that he employs between phenomenology, so a kind of, phenomenology, right, is the method by which you look very closely at the way that the world registers in our minds, in our consciousness. And then if you look at language, you can sort of add to that kind of common sense approach, or what has been the deliverance to our ethical lives and our political lives of the ordinary interactions of humans down through the centuries, right? This is what sort of accumulates in ordinary language. It's what accumulates in our phenomenology. And so I think Kolnai would say to any skeptic, he would say, well, I'm the one who's trying to stay quite close to common sense experience. And of course, also another rather interesting thing about him is that takes him into the Scottish Enlightenment. And we'll probably talk about that a bit later, because the Scottish Enlightenment had a kind of a common sense theory of the way to understand our social and political lives.
So are Kolnai's writings only of interest to philosophers, or do they also touch upon questions of Christian doctrine?
So first, are they accessible? So he's a more accessible writer than, say, Balthasar or Chavara, but he's still quite a technical thinker. They're not. So he's in a kind of an academic, I would say, an academic writer. But he tries, because he is trying to do a kind of a phenomenology of our ethical lives. He's trying to do a ordinary language. It doesn't tend to be jargon driven, right? He's not using sort of very, very technical philosophical words, but he's extremely Germanic in a sense. He's constantly making distinctions, constantly trying to unearth sort of connections. So I think that in that sense, he is quite, he's not forbidding, but he is, people sort of need to understand he's an academic writer. Then, so far as the church is concerned, I would think the number one thing might be ecclesiology, in that his interest in the problem of privilege, hierarchy, the problem of the common man really goes quite interestingly to problems of the papacy, authority, the sort of the relationship between the sort of the enthusiasms within the church, spiritual movements, versus the sort of canonical church. I think if people were wondering about, well, what could be an intellectual justification for something like the papacy, then Kolnai has a lot to say about that. I mean, never mind just the other. I mean, the other thing is anyone doing moral theology should read Kolnai, right? Because he's got all sorts of ideas about that. But I mean, in terms of like a place that you might not directly think that ethical thought can help you with thinking about, for example, the governance of the church, then I think Kolnai is absolutely fantastic. You could do a really interesting ecclesiological work with him, I think.
How did the works of G.K. Chesterton contribute to Kolnai's conversion to Catholicism?
So the Francis Dunlop biography is quite good, but Francis is also quite clear about things that we don't know. So the actual intricacies. So, for example, another thing we don't know is that pre-World War One, Kolnai, he was working as a journalist, and he was a man of the left. Now, he was not a Marxist. He was not even, I would say, a socialist. He was sort of center left. Comes out of World War II, and he has become quite an interesting conservative thinker. And in the biography, Francis is like, yeah, we just don't know what happened there. How did he get from where he was pre-war to? So there are things that we don't really know, and it's the same a little bit with his conversion. We don't particularly know much about it. As I say, he was, and why he was an Anglophile, even at the age of 14, I don't know. But I'll assume that in being in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it's in the air, and of course he was very good at languages. So probably as a young boy, he was already being able to read English, and I would have thought that something like Chesterton would be a wonderful place for a non-native speaker to enter into the English language. But more than that, I'm not sure we can say. We don't have the biography. There isn't a strong sort of trail of letters or things like that. And of course, because his life was highly interrupted, the other thing that's in the biography is that it was quite hard for Francis to get to know people who had known Kolnai. Francis Dunlop had actually been a student of Kolnai's. But beyond that, it wasn't that easy to be able to trace sort of sources and influences. As I say, one thing you would notice for anyone who goes and reads Kolnai, you'd often be left wondering, wait, where are these ideas coming from? Who is he reading? On the ideas are very original, but no one works in a vacuum. So we know that he was reading Burke. We know he was reading De Vittoria. We know he was reading the Scottish Enlightenment thinker Thomas Reid. Because he tells us this, right? But beyond that, beyond what he kind of formally tells, and of course he's constantly reading Shayla, but beyond that, it's not always easy to kind of trace the sort of the lineage of ideas.
So is the report that Chesterton contributed to conversion apocryphal, or is there
I think he
some truth in it?
I think he says it. He
doesn't explain exactly how.
No, but he says, yeah, Chesterton was very important. There is a, I think it's called My Political Memoir or something like that. There is a short autobiography. It's incomplete. I do think Kolnai had trouble completing projects. So, for example, when he was a refugee in England, he did receive a number of academic grants for various kinds of books that he would promise, and very few of them came to fruition. It's a little bit like one of the books we might talk about today, The Utopian Mind, that he was given a grant to write that book. The grant was renewed, so the grant was over 2 years, but he never got terribly far with the book, even though he'd been thinking about these ideas for a very, very long time. So I think, now, of course, he was a sickly man. He was very poor. He had no position in English society. He was always on the fringes. He taught at Bedford College, one of the London colleges of the University of London, but he was on the fringes of that. So, these things, it's not easy. It's not easy to write consistently when one has a difficult material circumstances.
And how did you discover Kolnai and what made you a fan?
I actually forget. So I use Kolnai in all my works. I love Kolnai. But I'm not sure how I first came across him. I certainly know the book I first read was the Daniel Mahoney book, Privilege and Liberty and Other Essays in Political Philosophy. And that might be the book that I would recommend people
start with,
because it's not so much about ethics, but it's very much about political philosophy. And it's stunningly original. It's a set of essays, stunningly original. Anyone who wants to kind of know about why Marxism and fascism remain resilient today, Kolnai is so Kolnai's sort of political focus was always, okay, what's the fate of liberal democracies squeezed between fascism and Marxism? Just because, of course, he lived that reality. But he believed it would be an enduring problem. And indeed, right today, 50, nearly 60 years after Kolnai's death, we're back in this kind of circuit of these three fundamental ideologies and how they link and what are their relationships. And so I would say, both for contemporary reasons and for sort of immediate finding Kolnai gripping, then Privilege and Liberty and Other Essays would be the place to start. And that's where I started. How I came across the book, I am honestly not sure. Because although I think Kolnai is enormously important, he still is not especially read, not even by the Hungarians. And you would have thought that, given contemporary Hungary with Viktor Orbán, some of the institutions of learning they've established, you'd have thought that Kolnai would be of tremendous. I mean, I think he's of interest, but I'm not aware of any particular groundswell of interest in Kolnai, publication in Kolnai. I mean, there's certainly things happening, but nothing remotely like Heidegger or even maybe even Husserl, right? Who's a super technical thinker. Way more people reading Husserl than are reading Kolnai.
Kolnai is one of several important political philosophers formed and active in Germany and Austria between the two world wars, who were not only forced to immigrate to English-speaking countries with the rise of Nazism, but also defended classical political thought against its modern counterparts. Unlike Leo Strauss or Erich Vogelin, Kolnai was Catholic. What are the main differences between his political thought and theirs?
I think I would, just to get at this, great question. I think I would go against your starting assumption. Like, I don't think he was that interested in classical thought. So although he knew Greek and Latin as well as Vogelin or Strauss, of course he did. He could go head to head with anybody on those languages. I don't think he was terribly interested in them. I don't think he was terribly interested in the classical world. Nor especially, to be honest, the medieval world. They don't particularly figure. As I say, although his baptismal name, is after Aquinas. He's not a Thomist. I think Kolnai thought that liberal democracy, the emergence of liberal democracy, more or less, let's say in 18th century England, was a watershed moment. And there was not a lot of reason to think outside of liberal democracy, communism, and fascism, that we had entered into a mass civilization. That is to say, high populations, commerce and industry, social communications, newspapers and radio at his time, TV slowly emerging around the time of his death, and now, of course, social media. And so we've got mass communications. And I think that he thought that if we're going to do political philosophy, because that's the phenomenology. That's the phenomenology we have to work with. We are in the West. We are fundamentally liberal democratic, and then with two possibilities, which the West has experimented with. So, with Vogelin, right, you have these tremendous sweeps of history, not only looking at the deep history of the West, right, but even over into China. And then, of course, with people like Leo Strauss, right, it's very much about trying to reclaim something like the Greek understanding of nature. And of course, Kolnai is not a natural law theorist. Right, so he doesn't start with dynamics. He abandoned Freud. So he was no longer interested in dynamics. He was no longer interested in desire. He was a kind of very cognitive thinker, right? How is it that categories of meaning appear to the mind? So that, of course, and of course, one encounters the natural world. Of course, one does, right? But it's not the starting point for his thought. He's looking at the sort of the dynamic structure of the human being. Now, he is a moral realist, and he is committed to moral objectivity. So just as someone like Strauss wants a control on the sort of the historical development of politics, Kolnai also wants a control on the historical development of politics, right? But it comes from this Schillerian insight into value hierarchies.
Well, that brings us into the first book, Kolnai's Phenomenological Analysis of Disgust, with the Aurel. What is disgust and how does it manifest objective moral values?
Yeah, this is the Kolnai book which is most in the mainstream.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.